Days ago, I brought you a video talking about the biggest change in the history of One Piece. It's moved from a weekly format to a seasonal model. In this video, I don't want to focus on the news, but on what got to that point. Why didn't One Piece change overnight? It was a transformation that had been brewing for years, both in its animation and in its way of being told and produced. From those first simple episodes in the 2000s to the spectacular sequences of Wano and Egghead, the anime went through an enormous technical and creative evolution. In this video, I want to review how One Piece went from being an anime made for television to a production that now visually competes with the best of modern anime, and why that evolution inevitably led it to its new era. When One Piece began broadcasting in 1999, Japanese anime was very different from the one we know today. It was a time when television ruled everything. Anime was not intended to be watched via streaming or to generate viral clips, but rather to fill a fixed time slot each week. In that context, One Piece was born with the classic Toei animation structure, a continuously broadcast anime, where the priority was not the quality of each episode, but rather regularity. The goal was simple. There would always be a new episode every Sunday, no matter how much it cost to make it. During those early years, anime functioned almost like an extension of manga. The animation was simple. The backgrounds were static, the movements were limited, and shots or effects were often reused to cut costs. It was not a question of carelessness, but of a system. The weekly production model demanded speed over detail. Even so, One Piece managed to stand out for its energy. The characters were expressive, the comedy worked, and the adventurous tone felt unique even within the technical limitations. At that stage, One Piece was more television than animation. It did not seek to impress visually, but to accompany. The episodes felt routine, part of a habit that fans maintained week after week. In many Japanese homes, One Piece was what the family watched every weekend. It was a stable, reliable product that represented the spirit of anime in the 2000s. Long-lasting, consistent, and designed to last. But that stability came at a cost. As the years passed, the visual style began to lag behind. While studios like Madhouses of Bonds experimented with more complex compositions, Toei continued to work with the same base of techniques it had been using since the 90s. The combat was slower, the cameras more rigid, and the lighting practically non-existent. One Piece was kept alive by its story, not its animation, but that still had its charm. The anime conveyed a sense of warmth that many more modern productions failed to achieve. There was something artisanal about those hand-painted backgrounds, the exaggerated expressions, and the imperfect but characterful animation. One Piece didn't need to look incredible to be emotional. It took watching Luffy smile or the Straw Hats go to another island to feel like you were following a real story, a story with soul. But the industry didn't stop there. Between 2005 and 2010, competition grew fiercer. Anime like Naruto Shippuden, Full Metal Alchemist, and the later Shingeki no Kyojin began to raise the visual standard for anime. The global audience grew thanks to the internet, and what had previously been a product designed only for Japan began to be appreciated by international audiences as well. Fans began to notice the differences. The anime One Piece was beloved, but it looked old. At the same time, the pace of the mission remained the same. A new episode every week, with no real breaks. And that made significant technical progress impossible. Animators barely had time to correct mistakes, much less experiment or plan ambitious scenes. Toei was a machine that worked tirelessly, an industrial structure that produced anime on an almost unimaginable scale. The interesting thing is that despite this, One Piece survived and grew not because of its animation, but because of its narrative and the heart of its story. While other anime relied on spectacle, it relied on emotion. The Alabasta Saga and Inlobi Marine Fort were arcs that demonstrated that even with limited resources, direction and music could turn simple moments into unforgettable scenes. But the contrast with the following years would be brutal because what came next, especially from then on, completely transformed the visual identity of anime. If the One Piece of the 2000s was a consistent and simple television product, the One Piece of the following decades would be an hour that sought to leave a visual mark in each episode. But that transition did not happen overnight. It was a learning process of trial and error, where each animation studio adjusted its style, its team, and technology. The result was that a studio that for years was criticized for its mechanical production became one of the benchmarks of modern animation. But to understand that leap, we must first look at the point where everything changed. The Wano arc, the moment when One Piece stopped being just another anime to become a visual experience on another level. The real turning point in the history of the One Piece anime was the Wano arc, which began in 2019 as just another arc and ended up becoming the biggest visual revolution in anime in over 20 years. Up until that point, many fans had already viewed the anime with affection, but also with resignation. They knew that the story was good, but that the animation could be much better. The arrival of a new team marked the beginning of a new era. Tatsuya Nagamine, already known for his work on the Dragon Ball Super Broly movie, took over as director with a much more cinematic vision. Alongside figures like Midori Matsuda and young animators who no longer wanted to follow the classic television model, One Piece ceased to be just a long anime. It became a space where directors could experiment, try out styles, and break structures that had previously seemed untouchable. The first thing that changed was the visual palette. Well, it introduced a completely different use of color, saturated tones, marked contrasts, backgrounds with more vivid textures. Scenes stopped feeling flat. Each island, each fight, and each sunset had its own identity. The drawing became more expressive, and lighting effects became part of the narrative. Instead of just showing action, anime began to convey emotion through color. The camera direction also changed. For the first time, One Piece battles began to feel dynamic. Camera movements that were impossible for 2000s television were used. Long takes, rotations, violence, extreme angles, the whole feeling of being inside the fight. Animators began to work with much more detailed layouts, and digital effects helped create depth without losing the anime's characteristic 2D style. But perhaps the most important change was the pure animation. Toei began collaborating with freelance digital animators and young artists from Japan who had trained watching modern productions, and the result was a hybrid between the classic energy of One Piece and the modern fluidity that characterizes today's anime. Fights stopped relying on dialogue and started telling visual stories on their own. The best example of this was the fight between Luffy and Kaido. The showdown wasn't just Wano's narrative climax, it was also a statement of intent, with Todd proving he could be on par with, or even surpass, the industry's most acclaimed studios. Every blow carried weight, every transition was calculated, and each episode could function as a mini-movie. The community began to talk about One Piece not just for its story, but for its animation. But of course, reaching that level came at a cost. The weekly pace began to feel increasingly demanding. Animators were delivering top-notch work, but it required more production time and coordination. To maintain that quality, Todd needed to completely reorganize his schedule, and he did so by taking strategic breaks. Something unthinkable years ago. It was the beginning of the change in mindset that defines the new format today. Wano also brought about a narrative evolution. The staging became more symbolic, with special attention paid to gestures, shot composition, and emotional lighting. The anime stopped simply reproducing the manga. It began to reinterpret it. Key moments like Odin's entrance or Yamato's flashback showed that Toei understood something fundamental. That animation could bring something new to the original without betraying it. From then on, One Piece stopped being just a long-running hit and became a serialized film production. Toei found a balance between the classic essence of adventure shonen and the visual ambition of modern anime. And most interestingly, this process did not end with Wano, who came later in the head arc, confirming that the change was not an exception, but a definitive direction. Now that the hiatus from January to March 2026 has been announced, and the return in April with the F arc, no one sees it as a weakness, but rather as a logical consequence of everything Wano demonstrated. The anime could no longer sustain this level without rethinking its work system. What used to seem like an obligation, broadcasting weekly, was now seen as an obstacle. One Piece had evolved too much to continue operating under the same rules as 20 years ago. For a long time, the animation was seen as a factory, a giant that churned out anime non-stop, more concerned with quantity than quality. It was uncommon to hear criticism about the visual style or pacing, but over the years everything became an example of reinvention within the industry. It went from being a studio that manufactured episodes as if they were serial products to one that sought identity, style, and visual prestige. And One Piece was at the center of that transformation. This change did not happen overnight. During the 2010s, Toei began to notice that the global anime market was expanding at an enormous speed. Streaming platforms, piracy, and viralization on social networks meant that each spectacular scene could give the anime a second life. Audiences were no longer satisfied with watching a new episode every week. They wanted each episode to be worth watching. That pressure led Toei to update his way of working, both technologically and creatively. The turning point came when the studio decided to bet on a more cinematic direction for its biggest franchises. Films like Dragon Ball Super, Brawley Superhero, and One Piece Red were laboratories where Toei experimented with new tools, digital cameras, 3D effects, hybrid rendering, and more realistic gradients. Although not all of these attempts were perfect, they hoped the studio would discover a more modern visual language and a different philosophy. Fewer episodes, but more impact. At the same time, Toei began to open its doors to a new generation of artists, young animators who had grown up watching the work of studios like Fotable Reborns and who wanted to bring a more dynamic and experimental perspective. Many of them came from the freelance world, and One Piece became their testing ground. What had previously been an anime produced under a rigid formula became a creative space where each episode could have its own style, a different director, and a particular visual identity. This flexibility was especially noticeable in Wano and Egghead. Unlike the early years, where episodes were almost identical visually, Each installment now had its own rhythm and tone. Some episodes were explosive and cinematic, while others were introspective and slow-paced. One Piece still understood that variety was not a flaw, but rather a sign of vitality. The studio stopped being afraid of change and began to use it as a creative engine. Internally, the philosophy was also transformed. The old weekly production system, like an assembly line, was replaced by a more segmented structure. Teams began to work in blocks and with longer delivery times. The art direction and digital compositing departments were strengthened, and animation supervisors were given greater freedom to propose ideas. In other words, Toei went from executing orders to fostering vision, but perhaps the most important change was in mentality. For decades, Toei was criticized for being conservative, maintaining the same style, the same colors, the same way of moving the camera, and today that image has disappeared. One Piece was the project that forced the studio to adapt or die. In the process, they reinvented themselves. It's not just a Sunday studio, but a label that aims to compete in quality and prestige with the most respected names in current anime. The 6-month hiatus between October 2024 and April 2025 was a sign of that change. Toei understood that taking time was not a sign of weakness, but of respect for its own work. The result was immediate. The head art showed a technical and artistic consistency that could hardly have been achieved without that break. And most importantly, it showed that fans were willing to wait if the result justified it. With this new philosophy, Toei no longer seeks to survive by making anime every week, or to create memorable visual experiences. It wants each season of One Piece to feel like an event, not an obligation, and that completely changes the relationship between the studio and the audience. What used to be routine is mal expectation, and what used to be television is now spectacle. Therefore, more than a simple technical update, Toei's transformation is a cultural change. It is the shift from an industrial model to an artistic one, from producing episodes to building a legacy. And One Piece, which for years was the proof of the resistance to the weekly format, today becomes the symbol of a new era where quality, vision, and production time finally matter more than the schedule. The announcement that One Piece will cease to be a weekly anime and will start airing in seasons was not only a production decision, but a statement. After more than 20 years, anime is abandoning the model that has accompanied it since its inception to enter a completely different stage, one where each return will be experienced as an event. In practice, the new format consists of a maximum of 26 episodes per year and a direct adaptation, chapter by chapter, of the original manga. But beyond the numbers, what is important is what it means in terms of philosophy. It is still not looking to fill the television week after week. It seeks for each episode to have weight, identity, and purpose. One Piece will go from being a weekly constant to a concentrated, carefully planned experience, where each arc is built with the same level of detail as a movie production. And this completely changes the way the public relates to One Piece. For over 2 decades, anime has been part of a routine. Everyone knew that Sunday was One Piece Day, but that routine is going to turn into anticipation. Every return will be anticipated and every hiatus will be an opportunity to recharge expectations. It's a change that not only affects the structure of the show, but also the way it's remembered. This transformation isn't unique to One Piece, but in its case it carries special weight. It's the anime that defined the weekly anime era, and now it could also be the one that marks its end. The shift to a seasonal format confirms something many studios have already understood. Television is no longer the center of anime. Today, the priority is impact. Viewers aren't looking for quantity, they're looking for moments that leave a mark on them, and One Piece has the potential to deliver those moments with more consistency than ever. But change will also have consequences for the narrative pace. Adapting one manga chapter per episode will give the anime more precision, control, and fidelity. Scenes won't have to be artificially extended to fill time, allowing each arc to maintain the narrative tension of the manga and the animation to focus on enhancing the story, not dragging it out. Fans have been asking for something like this for years, and it's finally being made possible without compromising visual quality. From a production standpoint, the system also frees up creative teams. Working with a more expansive schedule gives them time to plan out scenes, improve coordination between animators and directors, and fine-tune the art direction. What used to be an endless cycle of weekly episodes will now be a more structured and healthy process.